Welcome to the Exponential Edge podcast with your host, Arya Salur. I'm excited to have you join me on this journey, exploring the forefront of technological advancements and innovation that will shape our future. As a junior at Acton-Boxborough Regional High School in Massachusetts and the CEO of SecArmor, a cybersecurity startup, I'm fascinated by the transformative power of technology. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into 5 key areas that are poised for exponential growth in the next decade. We'll be exploring the realms of cybersecurity, generative AI, sustainability and climate tech, biotech and human longevity, as well as the reshoring of manufacturing. And we'll also go over rising startups disrupting the marketplace. These topics and businesses hold immense potential to revolutionize our world and redefine the way we live, work, and interact. Each episode will feature insightful conversations with experts, thought leaders, and visionaries who are at the forefront of these fields. In just 30 minutes, our goal is to provide you with 5 signature nuggets of wisdom from our guests. These key takeaways will empower you with knowledge and help you stay ahead in an ever-evolving technological landscape. Without further ado, let's introduce our guest for this week. Hello, everyone. Today, our guest is PH Mullen, CMO of Interactions. Hi, PH.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you too. So let's just get right into it. Obviously, you've had quite the journey, and I wanted to thank you for coming on to the podcast today. So you went to Dartmouth, first off, and you were on their swim team. You were an English major in Dartmouth, but your career shifted to journalism and then into marketing and technology. So I wanted to ask how that shift, first off, came about.
It's a really powerful question because of the time that I graduated from college. So I graduated in the early 1990s. A couple years later, this thing called Netscape went public and brought a consumer browser into the world. None of us knew that in the late 80s and early 90s, unless you were a computer engineer and really thinking about tech. And very few people were thinking about that. So I was really fortunate, Ari. I was able to go to Dartmouth. I was able to do well there. I swam. I participated in a lot of different things. And I was a quintessential liberal arts student in the Northeast. What does that mean? It means I would wake up each day really thinking about how to explore new ideas, how to understand the world around me in all the cool, neat ways that I was being presented with different people from different walks of life. So if you want to think about what that looked like in the 90s, it meant a lot of people carrying books. That was a thing back then rather than laptops. And we would study all kinds of different areas, from literature, which is where I focused. I had a minor in creative writing because I knew by the time I was halfway through high school I would be a writer. I knew that I wanted to make an impact in the world. I came out of high school as a National Merit Finalist, as a president of class, as a editor of the paper, doing very well in sports. I had a lot of opportunity and a lot of privilege helped get me there. I come from the Midwest, and so my goal had been to move into the East Coast and be able to pursue all these neat things that were opening up in the world. I exited as a writer. I moved to Italy when I graduated because it was a recession and I was unable to find a job in America. In my last 2 years of college, I never looked at a report card because I was only learning for learning's sake. In my last 2 years of college, I did not do a class that had more than 12 people in it. So I no longer cared about the subject as much as I cared about the interaction with people back and forth. So my journey in some ways was quite unique from how a lot of people were moving through the machine of college in order to get an organized job, an organized future, perhaps in finance, management, consulting, etc. I ended up in Italy at the end of a train station with half of my net worth in my left shoe and half of my net worth in my right shoe, and wearing a backpack. And I was able to get a job as an office manager at the Associated Press, one of the large global news networks. And I worked
Yeah.
there ultimately for a year, and I was able to write dozens of stories that I never would have been able to do if I had stayed in America. That gave me the opportunity to come back to America, work in Washington, D.C. as a newspaper reporter, and to speed it all up, I was convinced that I was going to be a book author and a investigative reporter. And then I moved to California in 1995 when the aforementioned Netscape just was going public, and saw this whole new opportunity in this whole new world to start thinking about how do I take words, ideas, concepts, and storytelling and convert that into more of a business orientation around tech.
Yep. And then that's I believe that's when you transitioned into your job at Netflix, and you worked on something similar to what you do today, right? Customer experience, and that was a big part in Netflix kind of taking over Blockbuster during that early period, right? So could you go through that clash that when you were a part of it, and then uh, kind of give us some key lessons from that era and your experiences in it.
So Netflix started in the late 1990s, and it started with DVDs through the mail. And this was a revolutionary concept. It started because the founder, Reed Hastings, one day left the movie that he had rented from Blockbuster under the seat of his car. It was Apollo 13. And a week, 2 weeks later, he looked at it, and the late fee was more expensive than to have gone out and bought the movie at the time. And this was, forever ago. And so that started this concept of what if we put a DVD through the mail, would it break? And nobody knew whether it would break or not. And once we discovered that it wouldn't break, we started up this company. I was not part of the first initial team, but I was part of what we now call the OGs of Netflix, the original gangsters. We were less than 100 people, and we lived in this bubble where we just kept churning DVDs through the mail and expecting at any point competitors would see what we were doing and see that the business was growing and see that there was an appetite for it, and they would come after us. Well, it was to build a network like this back when it was still physical meant that we had to open up dozens of little mini distribution centers all around the country, and we stocked them with 10,000 DVDs, 20,000, whatever. They were constantly changing every month or so as your habits would change and your viewership would evolve as new releases came out. There might have been a small room that would host DVDs for somebody like you, and you would make a request. We would send it to you and speed it up to about 48 hours. And you would say, oh my God, I've never had such an amazing experience. Doesn't it? It sounds so antiquated today, doesn't it? So Ari, here's one of the really neat lessons to speed all of this up. Netflix became one of the most successful companies over the past 30 years. It redefined an entire industry. It redefined an entire category called entertainment. Netflix became so powerful that when it pushed everything into the digital environment and working it over, all the communication cables through all the different ways that you can access Netflix today, they built the backbone of the internet in South America, especially in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
That's how powerful it became in order to distribute movies to it. So, here's one of the really neat lessons, and we'll talk about it a little bit more because this is really important for somebody entering the workforce or entering school right now to completely understand. There's a book, a very famous one called The Innovator's Dilemma, and it was created by Clay Christensen out of Harvard. And what it talks about is how incumbent companies, when faced with radical disruptive change, cannot change in time. And there's some really natural reasons for that. They can't change in time because they already are invested in the old way of doing business. So now combine that with the weird story that I just told you about dozens of little locations, mailboxes, PO boxes that had 10,000 DVDs in it. Why didn't Blockbuster? Why didn't Walmart? Why didn't any of the other big incumbents, Hollywood Video, come after us at any time when they could have stolen the idea and taken it over within a year or so? They
Mhm.
didn't, because they had too much invested in the old way of doing business. And you can layer on top of that Kodak, which invented digital photography, yet never optimized it, and now is a shell of what it used to be. You can potentially look at Google today at having to now catch up tremendously with AI. They're so far behind, man. With Gemini, they have the power to catch up. But how did they
Mhm.
let this happen? In many ways, they invented AI, or at least a lot of
Yeah.
components that are in use today. Um, the Netflix story with the innovator's dilemma can kind of culminate like this. When we had the IPO, the CEO, Reed, showed up at the party wearing a jacket that had hundreds of Blockbuster cards on top, layered on top of it with clothespins. And we snipped them off with scissors one by one as we came up and we shook hands with him for the success that we had. Even in the several years after that took place, we kept waiting for the giant Blockbuster to wake up, and it never did. So constantly think about the disruption that's happening in the world today, the speed at which AI and everything else is occurring, and think about how hard it is for the old companies to move, thus creating insane opportunities for groups like Netflix.
Yeah, that's a great lesson for all our viewers. And I wanted to just shift topics a little bit to your mindset throughout this entire process, because as you were working at Netflix, as you were entering the workforce after college, you continued swimming, and you actually got so good that you have one of the fastest times for swimming the English Channel. And you also swam the longest swimming marathon in the world. I think it's called the Marathon Hernan Darius Parana. I don't know if I pronounced it
You got
right.
that 90% right. Paraná is the river in
Parana.
Argentina.
And I've actually been there. I've been to Iguazu Falls. Uh, I didn't swim in it like you did,
Yeah, I was
but
going to say, how was that swim downstream for you?
so 55 miles for those who don't know. I wanted you to talk about your mindset going through these long swims. English Channel is about 8 hours, and then the Piranha is about 9 hours, is what you took, I believe. So can you
Yeah,
talk about that mindset?
for sure. So uh, this is a conversation with a lot of storytelling in it. So I grew up swimming. In my small little town in Indiana, there had been the only Olympian ever out of the whole region was a swimmer, and he was about 15 years older than me. He's a friend of mine now. His name is Dan Harrigan. And growing up after he had come and triumphed, hundreds of us became involved in swimming, and it's such a neat thing that happens in small communities. So I was always an average swimmer, and the way I like to tell it is that I got to swim in the fast lane. There were five of us typically in the fast lane, and guess what?
Mm-hmm.
Four people make a relay, and I was fifth. And of those four of them became All Americans, and I was fifth. And I think sports shape our lives more than almost anything else out there. It teaches us how to be competitive. It teaches you how to hurt, teaches you how to love, teaches you how to set a goal and have a mindset around it. There are so many things that make sports unique and special in the world that, to my mind, they should be held up with a spotlight and on a pedestal as one of the most important things any of us as humans can engage in. Full stop. So I had the opportunity to swim in college, where I did fine. But again, I was average. There was something a little bit special about me, though. The longer that we swam, the better that I would do. And normally you wouldn't get this in positive environments. The team would get in trouble, and the coach would say, uh, I can't stand you people right now. Go swim for the next 60 minutes. I do not want to see a single person's face. And then we would go off and do it. Um, Over time, I got a chance to do a little bit longer and more stuff. And this is a really interesting thing. I got hurt in college. I broke my back, and I broke my back in a way in my sophomore year that enabled me to still walk around, but I could no longer participate in swimming competitively at the collegiate level, at least for a year and a half. And when
Mhm.
I started to come back on it, I began swimming in the lakes around Dartmouth and in the Connecticut River. You can actually, in Hanover, New Hampshire, Ari, swim in place in the Connecticut River. And it's a total piece of cake. You just go off the dock, from the dock where the boathouse is, you go out about 20 yards, you turn, and suddenly you're on an aquatic treadmill. And I loved it. I would get into a zone, and this becomes mindset, right? I could get into a zone, which I subsequently have learned with ultra long distance athletes. There are two ways you do it. You either blank out and you live in kind of this dreamlike state, or you're the type of person who becomes acutely conscious and aware of every single thing that was happening. I'm the former. I'm a person who can blank out, have a massive goal in front of me, and then just know what it is and start pursuing it. So ultimately, tying that all the way back to Italy, I had no friends in Italy when I moved there. And one day I got a pair of goggles in my pocket and I decided to go out with my running shoes on and keep running until I could find an adult swim team, a master's swim team. Found one, and they love to do open water. So I started swimming open water more and more when I was over there. And then when I came back to America, I started looking for long distance swims. And it turns out there is a world circuit of professional marathon swimmers. Sounds really neat. There weren't that many of us, the few, the proud, the mighty, but that enabled me to go travel on a couple different continents, swim in that amazing river, the Rio
Was
Parana.
there some qualification to join it, or was it just so few that anyone who was actually interested was like good enough?
Um, you could start by having a great degree of interest. With a lot of these, you had to prove that you could swim for that duration. There would be a couple certified swims. If you could go 6 hours in water that's a certain temperature, you were allowed to do longer swims. Um, and so I did that. I always had wanted to swim the English Channel. It was just one of those things I had heard about as a kid. And as I got more and more proficient in doing this, I really started setting that mindset toward achieving the goal, the goal of the English Channel. So, as a kid, as a high schooler, I had my mantra. I hope most people have mantras. Mine was no tomorrow. The way I lived and the way I thought about things was pushing everything to the absolute limit, leave nothing on the table from a sports perspective or even from a life perspective. By the time I graduated from college, that mantra had shifted, and I still use it today, which is there's always tomorrow. So in my case, I built several years of a journey. I was already on the professional circuit, so I'd already done that. It's the world's longest competitive swim, 55 miles in Argentina. But I built this mindset of going even further and making it colder. That was the English Channel. English Channel is about 59 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mhm.
Um,
And
and
it's
the way I
muddy
built
water too. It's not clear
that,
water. It's muddy water too,
there's a
right?
tremendous advantage of muddy water because
Oh,
if there's
really?
clear water, you start looking down and you start thinking what's going to bite you. If there's muddy water, you can kind of forget about it for a few minutes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I
wouldn't
got
think
I got
about that.
across it. I got across it
Hmm.
relatively fast. I think it's really important to have a mindset that you go out and you set goals, and if you don't achieve the goals, it's okay. It's okay to say I got close, but I didn't get it. I wanted to be one of the top 10 ever in the English Channel, and I
Mm.
was 11th. And so I got a lot of really great credit for that. But I'm talking about this 25 years later, and I'm still
Yeah.
annoyed that I didn't get it one place better than that. And that's okay. I'm not
How
going to
much
go back and
faster would you have had to do it to get that 10th spot?
yeah, I think it was like 8 minutes faster. So it was not 30 seconds. If it was 30 seconds, I would have a huge problem. But it was enough to say, okay, the folks are ahead of me. And at this point, now I look at climate change, I look at GPS, and I look at all the technology that has enabled it to be a much more efficient event. And it's great
Mhm.
because I get to be a grumpy old man in a rocking chair on the porch and being like, oh, it's so much easier for those kids today.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's like basketball, there's this big debate going on about how the older eras were not valued as much. They're not as good because obviously the skills in the game has evolved today. The competition's evolved, so
Yep.
I guess that's kind of similar to what you're
Oh, it's
talking about.
huge. And basketball's a
Mm-hmm.
great comparison. Five guys on the court, and you can see individual legends. Is Larry Bird better than Steph Curry, given the 30 or 40 years between the two of them? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's certainly a lot more fun to watch Steph Curry, and it'll probably be way more fun to watch the next generation when Steph's a
Mm-hmm.
45-year-old guy,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing what the new dudes will be doing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I wanted to talk about your book about the Sydney Olympics, Golden Water, and talk about. I don't know if you joined the Santa Clara Swim Club before you graduated college or after. I'm guessing after, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And um, how did that club influence you to write this acclaimed book about the Sydney Olympics and the swimmers that participated in it?
Yeah, it's so as I mentioned a moment ago, by the time I was in high school, I knew I was going to be a writer. I knew I was going to be a book writer. If the world had not changed so fast, I think I would have a shelf like the one behind you of all the books that I wrote. Um, and I miss the fact that I decided not to do that, but I'm grateful that I didn't because I
Mm-hmm.
think that it would have been a very difficult, challenging professional life to go in. But I wrote this book when I got done working for the Associated Press. I'd moved to California and I was swimming. So you see this, what I call a vector of impact, where you have several things that are important in your life. Where do they all converge? Where they converge is your vector of impact. And I'll talk probably a little bit more about that because I think it's one of the most important things people can have in their lives is knowing where their vector is. Turned out I found one of mine that I could write about something that I loved and I could talk about it, going back to that powerful word you said, with mindset, about what does it take to, in this case, follow the Olympic dream. So, Ari, really specifically, as an average athlete who dreamed of greatness, I wanted to know what it took to actually achieve greatness, to be the top
Mm-hmm.
0.01 in the world at something. And I had this great opportunity to work at the Santa Clara Swim Club, which had taken most of the top swimmers out of Stanford and put them there in the 2 or 3 years before the Olympics. And so this was an elite Olympic training camp. And
Mm-hmm.
what I discovered, honestly, was stunning. The book, I decided to write it when one day I was evaluating whether to write it. And there were two kids just 22, 23 years old. One was the world champion in the 200 breaststroke, and the other was not. And I watched them race at the end of a workout, all out effort, and the world champion outtouched the younger guy. And then for the next several minutes, the two of them worked together on how to improve both of their strokes so they could both be more successful. And very shortly after that, those two were number one and number two in the world in this event. And it was just absolutely stunning to me to have this, to see this happening, where these arch competitors were also best friends and were also working with
Yeah.
each other to make themselves successful. So I wrote the book. I followed a handful of people, most of whom failed at their goals, several of whom succeeded beyond all wildest dreams. The book is not about what place you get. It's about how do you pursue greatness in an ordinary world, and what do you do? What do you take from that on that whole journey? Um, it ended up doing quite well. It became, in some ways, one of the best sports books for swimming that has been produced. It's a little bit of a fun underground thing today. I still get people who buy it 20 years later and who
Mm-hmm.
send me copies to autograph. Coaches still give it out to teams where the athlete of the week gets to sign it on the front page. One coach showed me 40 signatures on his book, which I thought was awesome,
Wow.
but I really wish he had bought 40 copies of the book instead. And during COVID, there were a couple folks who ended up taking the book and turning it into a documentary and giving it to swim teams around the world to try to get people excited in these dark times that we were living in,
Yeah.
and how to just think about pursuing greatness, how to think about what's important in our own lives.
Definitely. And you talk about people still buying your book. Luckily, I got a
Hey,
copy delivered today. I didn't know if it would be delivered in time. I ordered it for this specific podcast, but luckily it got delivered today. Haven't gotten a chance to read it since it was just delivered, but definitely looking forward to it. And when you come by here next, definitely want you to sign it. Definitely
hey,
want that
I
autograph.
appreciate you getting that book. Fun fact about being a book author. A book that sells, this is probably old school now, but this is the type of contract that I have. A book that would sell for $24.95, which I believe was the original of that book, because you have the hard copy. I
Mhm.
made approximately $1.25 off of it. Um,
Really?
and when you talk about the world of disruption that's happening so fast across everything that we do, of course, today somebody can self-publish. Of course, today there are much stronger vehicles in many regards of how to get word out, whether it's a podcast like this, whether you're working on Medium, whether you're a top contributor on Reddit. None of that existed back then. And it's really cool to see how the old guard, in this case, the publishing industry, has kind of been disintegrated because of all the changes that have democratized the whole experience.
Yep. Social media, GoFundMe, all those types of things. Kickstarter. Those are a lot of independent publishers use Kickstarter now, and
It,
it's really
it is
successful.
exactly like to the point where I should look at you and say, you're halfway through your junior year in high school. How come you haven't published a book yet?
Well, I'm thinking about publishing one with lessons from all these podcasts soon. Just a little sneak peek. So
Exactly.
mhm.
Good. That's a nice breadcrumb trail you're starting to feed out to your
Yeah.
fans.
Yep, definitely. And talking about your book, do you think you could share just a few key anecdotes from the book that would be impactful to our viewers?
Yeah. So this is not just about the book, man. This is about everybody and anyone trying to pursue some elusive gold ring. And
Mhm.
you got to give it your all. You got to ignore the noise and you got to focus on it. You have to be selfish, but it should be intentional selfishness. Meaning,
Mhm.
you can't be selfish forever. You should never be selfish forever. But there are periods in time where you need to be. Think of someone in medical school who's a resident and what they have to do to get through that. Think of a startup founder. Think about a quarterback who's getting ready for sectionals or for state championships. There are
Mhm.
times when you need to put singular focus and pursue a goal with nothing else in the world in front of you. That's one thing, and it's okay to do that. Another thing is that you can't do it alone, ever, ever, ever. You need family, you need friends, you need people behind you. These are normal lessons, but when you are with this top elite level, you really truly understand um, what it's like to risk in your own mind everything that you have in order to
Mhm.
achieve this type of greatness when you know that it will remain elusive to you. Um, those are two of the biggest ones, I would say. I would also say that going back to what I talked about a moment ago when I was celebrating sports, there is a code of conduct in sports across every sport, across every ethnicity, every corner of the world, and all time. Somebody who is thoughtful of what those values are is going to get really far in the world. I will guarantee you that when you get into the working world, you can quickly understand, almost in a conversation or two, who is you are working with, who has participated in team sports before and chased these type of goals.
Yep. Definitely. And even in school, you can, even if like you meet kids from another school, you can kind of tell who plays sports just by how they carry themselves. And just it's not just specific to confidence or I guess confidence or smarts. There's an interlocking between them many of the time.
It's one of the things that I believe in, and this is just very loosely in how I think about it, is that you have your own trinity of a body, mind, and soul. And this is actually not religious, although of course there are overtones of that. It's exactly what you just said. Your body can do so much. Your mind is what carries you there and then carries you beyond it. The third part, the soul, is, how do you respond emotionally, psychologically, to different things that you are doing. I'm the head advisor of a couple different startups. And I'm not the head advisor of this, but there's a Y Combinator company that I'm very close to in particular, that they've just graduated. And I'm looking at these young entrepreneurs drive 18 hours a day, 6-7 days a week, really nonstop. And they got the body, they got the mind. One of the most important things for me to share with them is, guys, chill out every once in a while. Take a break and make sure that you're balancing it. All of that comes from sports, and all of that comes from lessons of knowing what it's like to be right at the edge of trying to do something amazing.
Yep, definitely. And talking about your tech career now, after your journalism, and I don't know if you still did competitive swimming as much during this time, but you founded the startup PowerCloud, and then got acquired by Comcast shortly after. So, can you just talk about what it's like to be a small startup and then the culture change after being acquired by a huge company? How did that culture shift?
It's a great question because it's a massive shift, and the people who can toggle between both are going to be really successful, I believe. So before that, I had worked with a small private equity firm. That's a firm that will invest in other companies, and then many times that's as far as it goes. But the very small one that I had is roll up your sleeves, just a couple people. We would invest in startups, and then we would become interim executives to help them go to the next level. So PowerCloud was a great startup, but overall, I probably worked with about 30 of them. And there's some
Wow.
neat things and tenets to think about if someone is going on the startup journey. There's also some warnings to have too. We could dive into that if needed. But in the case of PowerCloud, check this out, man. We were a 15-person company. And when we sat around the table with 15 of us, 13 native languages were spoken at home. It was
Really?
exactly what Silicon Valley is all about, where the best minds in the world all come together and are all working with a common currency. In this case, it's coding. We built a tool that is now in 25 million homes in America, which means it's supporting over 200 million people every day. It's a Wi-Fi tool. If you have Comcast in your house, Xfinity, you are using the technology that PowerCloud built to power your Wi-Fi. We were purchased by Comcast in order to help Comcast speed its own adoption curve. We talked about the innovator's dilemma earlier. Believe it or not, Comcast, a Fortune 15 or Fortune 20 company, is one of the greatest examples of the past decade that has broken the tyranny of the innovator's dilemma. They saw the writing on the wall that cable was slowing down. Cable is ultimately not going to be part of the equation, and they have pivoted in a massive way over the past 15 years. So we come in full of innovation and immediately ran into a bureaucracy of tens of thousands of employees who are not ready for this type of technology. So we were ultimately incredibly successful. Many startups that get acquired into a large company are not, for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes it is culture clashes between hurry up, start, get it done, and slow down, be thoughtful, make sure you don't make mistakes. There's places for both of those. I can tell you 1,000 things that compare the two, but for a person who might find themselves in that experience, the wonderful experience to be a small startup that then gets acquired, what you want to do is you want to instantly shift your mentality to think about, how am I thoughtful with my political game? How am I thoughtful about my internal evangelism? That means constantly, not once or twice, but constantly talking about the values of your product, the excitement that you have, and really drive and bring that startup cool energy into a large company. Oftentimes, that's one of the most important things they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. And then transitioning to your current work at Interactions, you specialize in conversational generative AI, like the chatbots that we can see in a lot of the retail websites or service websites. So, first, could you explain to our listeners who maybe might not know what this is, what a conversational generative AI is, what a virtual assistant is, and maybe how it's trained, how they train this assistant using generative AI?
Absolutely. And first, here's a tip for you, for anybody. If you do not have several generative AI apps on the first screen on your phone, you are falling behind. You should have 2, you should have 3, you should be tapping on them every day, comparing them back and forth, and engaging in real generative conversations with them. So let me just frame a couple of things for you. First, let's make it easy. Interactions, which is based in Boston, is one of, I get to say it, we're one of the OGs of conversational AIs. We have been around for about 20 years. We are a company that primarily leads with voice conversations for customer support. So your airline is messed up. Your order did not arrive in time, or you have to change the address of your order. When you call into the 800 number, usually a little annoyed, frustrated, or maybe even a panic, we are a company that says, how can I help you today? I understand natural language. And you start speaking. So that's what we do. We do it for many of the best brands in the world who care more about customer service than normal companies. So now start thinking about your favorite brands and start thinking about whether they care about it or not. Those are our ideal customers. Because we're white glove, because we take it an extra step. We create what we call craveable experiences, where you get off the phone or the chat with us and you turn to your friend and you're like, you know what? I can't believe it, but that was not a bad experience. In fact, that was kind of cool. So now here's a way to think about this. Conversational AI is different than generative AI. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details on it, but to keep it really superficial, because this now gives you a router for understanding when you're engaging in experiences, what type of experience are you engaging in? Even before conversational AI, you know how sometimes you have to call maybe your dentist and it says press 1 to talk to a receptionist, press 2 to schedule an appointment. Well, all right, that touch tone dialing system debuted the same month that JFK was assassinated. That's how old it is. Conversational AI, exponential leap forward, takes the company's, let's call it, ecosystem of what is needed and creates large libraries, large language models about what the responses may be. So if you are calling a dentist office, you're not going to ask about getting your muffler changed, for example. So we create in conversational AI these libraries that then cover all the use cases, presumably, that you will have when you are trying to solve a customer issue. Generative
Mhm.
AI is completely different. Generative AI builds on itself, as you probably know. And so the answers are going to be unique every time because they're not pre-scripted. They're also going to use information that they are accumulating with responses, with additional feedback, additional data that it's collecting to continue
Mhm.
to refine. So in a
Yeah.
conversational AI model, there's no hallucinations because it's a narrow, contained, guardrail centric experience. Generative AI, you've heard about these hallucinations, you've heard about these mistakes that happen. And that's what everybody's trying to solve for right now. Fun fact, before this podcast, I asked one of the new generative AI tools, and I could have done this with any of them. I think I used, which one did I use? I used Bing. And I said, who are the remaining underdogs in March Madness with the NCAA basketball tournament? Well, guess what? It gave me both men and women. Props to the women. They finally arrived. The game's better than the men. But the generative AI mixed the teams back and forth. So it confused who was a women's team and who was a men's team. It also gave me about half the teams were no longer in the tournament, right? It had not been
Mhm.
updated in the
Yeah.
past 72 hours. Um, that's the world that we're in right now. And that's a little bit off track from what we are with conversational AI, but it gives you
Mhm.
here's what you should think about. Um, this is an excellent example of how disruptive and how fast the world is changing because before November of 2022, which is when OpenAI publicly announced, we were on the cutting edge of what was happening in this type of customer support communications. Suddenly,
Mhm.
companies like ours are looking around and saying, wow, amazing opportunity. How do we now have the guts to pivot, to grow, to expand so we can start using this in a way that doesn't forget the core, which is the customer having a great experience?
Mhm. Yeah. And obviously, you've seen this technology evolve firsthand as you've been in Power Cloud and now Interactions for the past 20 years. And where do you see this generative AI heading in the next few years? You talked about interactions changing with the times, uh, hopping on this new trend. Where do you see this trend evolving in the next few years?
I think it is bigger, bolder, more disruptive than anybody is talking about, except those on the extreme edge of how we talk about it. I think it's going to reframe and reshape the world that we live in, not always for the good.
Mm.
I think that the genie is out of the bottle, and we will now be playing catch up, all of us, whether it's government rules, whether it is most of the companies globally. I think that it's going to create a massive chasm between haves and have nots. And very specifically, there's multiple ways you could think about that. Um, but let's just think about it with the privileged set, the people who are in high school, the people who are going to have the opportunity to go to college. It is going to create classes of folks who are on the bandwagon of AI and those who are being left behind. Let's talk about doctors. Um, AI is significantly better to read an X-ray or an MRI than a human is today. In fact, it's arguable. It's not even arguable. It is silly for a human to be the first entity that is reviewing an X-ray. Now, it should be right behind the AI and validating whatever is taking
Mm.
place. Of course, this is going to be happening in every single walk of life. Um, you guys, your generation, you've got to get ready for it. Past 18 months, it's been super hip to talk about going to college and becoming a prompt engineer. No, that is already dead. AI
Yeah.
is going to be its own prompt engineer.
Mhm.
Um, I think that here's the mentality that everybody entering their next stages of life needs to think about. And again, this is incredibly privileged that we get to have a conversation like this because AI is going to leave a lot of people behind. It's going to
Mm.
empower It's going to empower societies, but it's going to leave many behind. You, your friends, people who are graduating from college, you need to ask yourself, in a world run by the robots, how do you succeed? You succeed by owning the robots. It's that simple. And that's how you got to point yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Just to close us off, thank you for sharing that thought. And I wanted to ask if you could share 5 other key thoughts, key takeaways from our entire conversation today.
I know you told me to think of this, and I thought, my God, that's a big question. Okay, here's where I'm going with this. In 1975, Muhammad Ali was invited to Harvard to give a lecture. And as he started, some smart aleck kid in the audience yelled out, "Muhammad, give us a poem." And Muhammad took a deep breath and he gave the shortest poem in American history. Me, we. And that's where I'm going to end this and how we think about it. Let's think about me. We talked a lot about mindset. We talked about what the me needs to do. I think the me needs to own the robots. I think the me needs to have a mindset around goal orientation. I think that the me benefits tremendously by having the opportunity to have a holistic experience in this incredible world that we live in, the body, the mind, the soul. To my journey in Silicon Valley is not usual because I went sideways a lot of times. But I used a phrase earlier, and I talked about the vector of impact. Where can you bring the things that you're great at all to one single point? And for the most part, I had a really great understanding of what my vectors, plural, my vectors of impact should be and where they are: swimming, book writing, technology, startups, working with people, collaborating to do great things. When I look back at my career, what my vector is that I've had a really neat history of taking new emerging ideas and making them work at scale and telling stories around it. It's a pretty neat thing for an English major with a minor in creative writing to be able to say he's got to do. Everybody needs to understand their vectors of impact. That's me. The we side of it, this world is changing rapidly. We have got to do. We've got to do. We must have an approach that is collective. We've got to think about not just the me part of it. And here's a really easy example. I made a decision years ago that every company I worked with, I needed to be able to draw a straight line and say, whatever I'm doing, it's also helping the world with the greater good. When I mentioned that private equity group that I was with, it was in education technology. So many of the first digital tools that you had in your classroom, I knew the people who created them because we were working in ed tech K through 12 to bring in more personalized, more individualized learning. That was a wonderful connection to me. This is not hard to do, but you need to be intentional around it. Those are the big ones, right? And then in terms of, I mentioned this cool word, sideways. Be intentional when you go sideways, but don't be afraid to go sideways. Take a year off between high school and college. Gap year the crap out of your life. Write the book that you're talking about. Explore different cultures and dive into things that make you uncomfortable. I have this rule that if you're not significantly uncomfortable once every 30 days, you're not learning. My kids, I have 2 daughters, and they went to a middle school where over 40 languages are spoken at home. They got thrown into an environment that is the world in 2050, right? That's the we. That's how you want to think about things as you're charging forward and kicking butt with everything that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. And I asked this question to every one of my guests, and that's definitely the most unique answer I've gotten, but very insightful nonetheless. And definitely, that's an amazing way to answer this question. Thank you for taking that unique road. to this question. And thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of the Exponential Edge podcast. Thanks to our viewers for watching this episode, and tune in next week to see trends, businesses, and people that will see exponential adoption in the future. Thanks, PH.
All right. Keep rocking.
Yep. Bye.